Before the Federalists gave up their power after the election of 1800, the Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. Now, it created 16 circuit courts with a new judge for each and increased the number of clerks and marshals. Before he left office, Adams named John Marshall as Chief Justice, and he's going to be one of the greatest Chief Justices that we will have. And he also appointed Federalists to all the new positions, including 42 Justices of the Peace of the new District of Columbia. Now, all of that was done pretty quickly. Not all of the commissions were actually officially delivered, and in those days, even if you had been told that you had been given a position, until you actually had that commission, that piece of paper in your hand stating that, then you could not take over your job. Well, all of the commissions weren't delivered when Adams left office. The ones that hadn't been were left on the desk of the incoming Secretary of State, and that was James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's good friend, also from Virginia, and Jefferson had appointed him as Secretary of State. Well, Madison sees these commissions, realizes that they're all going to Federalists, and he refuses to deliver them. Now, one of those commissions was for a man named William Marbury. Marbury knew he had received the position, but he did not have that commission, and he was furious that Madison wasn't going to give it to him. And so he sues to have Madison deliver that commission. And this case is going to work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it's going to finally be issued as the case of Marbury versus Madison, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in our history. Now, the result of this is an important victory for the concept of a strong judiciary, because Marshall declares that although Marbury was entitled to his commission, the Supreme Court could not require it to be delivered because his request was based on an unconstitutional act of Congress. So for the first time, the court had declared an act of Congress unconstitutional. I should also tell you that John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson were cousins, and they also absolutely despised one another. And of course, they're also representing two different parties. Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, Marshall, a member of the Federalist Party. So they had very different views. And this is going to be played out over the next few years. Domestically, things went well for Jefferson. He repealed the tax on whiskey, which made him extremely popular. He cut down on expenses drastically so that the Treasury looked good, and had the good fortune to orchestrate the Louisiana Purchase. Now, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had been kind of running rampant throughout Europe, he is now the leader of France. And in 1800, he had actually taken Louisiana back under French control. Now, that scared Jefferson. So he sent Robert Livingston to try to talk the French out of it, or possibly some other territory. He didn't know really what was going on. And the talks are going to go on until 1803. Jefferson then sent James Monroe to help in that process. Now, shortly after he arrived, however, Talleyrand, who was the French foreign minister, asked Livingston if the U.S. would like to buy all of Louisiana. Now, one of Napoleon's armies had gotten bogged down in the West Indies. Had that army been successful, Napoleon probably would never have sold the Louisiana territory. But because they were bogged down and it was getting very expensive, Napoleon simply decided to withdraw from the hemisphere. So Livingston said yes. And by the treaty dated April 30th, 1803, the U.S. paid $11.25 million for Louisiana. By a separate agreement, the U.S. also agreed to assume French debts owed to American citizens up to $3.75 million, making the total price of the Louisiana Purchase $15 million. It more than doubled the territory of the United States. It's not just the current state of Louisiana. It included the present-day states of Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota west of the Mississippi, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, nearly all of Kansas, the portions of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado east of the Rocky Mountains, and Louisiana west of the Mississippi River, but including New Orleans. So this is a phenomenal deal for $15 million. Now, according to the Constitution, no power existed for such a treaty to be made, and Jefferson had always been one of those when the Federalists were in charge and were doing things that if it wasn't spelled out specifically in the Constitution giving them a certain right, that he had always talked about that, written about it, and it's a very easy thing to do when you're on the outside looking in. Well, now that he was on the inside, things are going to be a little bit different. He thinks that maybe an amendment ought to be added to the Constitution, giving him the power to make this purchase. But the commissioners, knowing how Napoleon was, because you never could really count on Napoleon sticking with the same thing day after day after day, or the same agreement day after day after day, they really were afraid that if they waited too long, Napoleon would pull the offer. So Jefferson finally agreed, went along, and in October of 1803, the Senate ratified the treaty. Meanwhile, Jefferson had asked for and received money from Congress for an expedition to the far northwest. As commanders, he appointed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis had been his secretary, so he knew him personally, and Lewis is going to go and ask Clark to be his co-captain, and this is going to become the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. They are going to go all the way to the Pacific with the help of a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, sending back specimens and drawings of what they found. She had been captured and sold to a Canadian trapper who married her and another captured girl, and on February 18th she gave birth to a son, and 2 months later set out with her son and this expedition for the Pacific. So she's going to go the entire way with them, and she's going to be carrying this baby with her along the way too. Now, Jefferson's first term ended on a serious note. A group of Federalists known as the Essex Junto, and that's ESSEX, Junto had been talking about getting their states to leave the Union, and they approached Aaron Burr to lead their scheme because they thought he could bring New York with them since he was from New York. Now, their plan depended on him being elected governor of New York in 1804. He failed, but not before Alexander Hamilton had made some unfavorable remarks about him in the press, and eventually that led to a duel in New Jersey in the same spot where Hamilton's oldest son had also dueled and died, basically defending his father's honor after his father had been caught in the sex scandal. Hamilton is going to be mortally wounded by Aaron Burr, and he's going to die, and Burr's political career is basically going to be destroyed. Hamilton will leave a wife and 7 children heavily in debt when he dies. So as the election approached, Jefferson ran with George Clinton against Charles Pinckney and Rufus King, and Jefferson and Clinton won. Now, in his second term, Jefferson had to deal with a conspiracy planned by Burr and a war in Europe. Exactly what Burr was planning is still a little unclear, but it seems that he wanted to set up an independent in the republic in the West with himself as the head. By the summer of 1806, he was in Kentucky recruiting men for an expedition to go to Arkansas. The men were organized and set off. Rumors were reaching Jefferson about this, and then he gets a letter from General James Wilkinson, who was the governor of the Louisiana Territory, and a man who had been approached by Aaron Burr about this. Wilkinson is also a double agent because he's also working for the Spanish government. But in this letter, he warns Jefferson of a deep, dark, wicked, and widespread conspiracy. And so Jefferson is going to order troops to go and arrest Burr, which happens in January of 1807 as Burr neared Natchez. Now, he's going to be sent to John Marshall, Chief Justice, because this was an important trial in Richmond. Both Jefferson and Marshall didn't really kind of, in a sense, bungled this. This trial was nothing like what you would have today. Jefferson was involved, and then he was promising pardons to conspirators who helped convict Burr, while Marshall attended a dinner party given by the Chief Defense Counsel at which Burr was also present. The main thing that came out of this trial was Marshall's definition of treason, and treason will be defined as levying war against the United States or helping their enemies, and it requires 2 witnesses to the same overt act for conviction. Burr was freed because they could not get 2 witnesses to a specific act. He is going to escape to France, but he will return to the United States in 1812 to practice law in New York. And at age 80, shortly before his death, he was divorced on grounds of adultery. So Burr was a character all the way to the very end. That's it for this one, and then when we come back, we will talk about the War of 1812.